Hello, I'm Joseph Bobrow, a Zen teacher, psychoanalyst, and the author of Zen and Psychotherapy, Partners in Liberation. My book has been newly reissued by Wisdom Publications in a paperback edition, with a new foreword by Norman Fisher and comments by Thich Nhat Hanh. I invite you to celebrate this book launch by tuning into a dialogue between my friend and colleague, Michael Diamond, and me. Michael is a training and supervising analyst at the Los Angeles Institute for Psychoanalytic Studies, as am I, and he has long been studying and practicing mindfulness. If you're moved to purchase my book, go to your local independent bookstore, and if they don't yet have it, ask them to order it. For information about my psychological practice, visit josephbobrow.com. To learn about Deep Stream Zen Institute and practicing Zen with our group from wherever you live, visit deepstreams.org. Each site has links to my writings and talks, and you can sign up for our Deep Streams newsletter with updates and an original piece of writing each month. That's josephbobrow.com and deepstreams.org. The beginning of Michael's kind introduction was unfortunately not recorded and begins in progress. So, let's dive in.
The Dalai Lama, Krishnamurti, Thich Nhat Hanh, D.T. Suzuki, along with so many esteemed psychoanalytic thinkers from Bion and Bolas to Eric Fromm and Jim Grodstein, Klein, Ogden, Winnicott, to name but a few. So we're really in for a treat, I think, today, to get inside the resplendent heart and mind of a very special and extremely human person, Joe Bobrow. So Joe, let me turn it over to you, and we'll start with a little piece you wanted to start with.
That's so sweet, Michael, and too kind. I am a complicated guy.
Yes, indeed.
Well, what I'd like to do is to begin with a couple minutes of meditation. Hang on again, to try to get this view happening. Whoops. Okay. A couple of minutes of meditation in honor of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and Rayshard Brooks, and all the victims of racial violence, present and past. So let's take a couple of minutes of silence to enjoy connecting with one another and to honor these people.
Thank you, Joe. The way we've structured this this morning is that I'm going to more or less interview Joe with a number of questions and try to bring out all that we can to really understand as much as we can about the intertwining paths of Zen and psychoanalysis. And in the last half hour or so, we're also going to open it up to questions from you in the audience. If you have questions, as you probably noted at the beginning, we'd like you to use your chat room and to send the questions to questions here. And we'll screen some of the questions and then, as time permits, use many of them that cover areas that we haven't already covered. So let me start, Joe, with asking you if you could perhaps share some of the personal path that led you both to create the book and also to undertake Zen training as well as psychoanalytic training. One of the things you mentioned in your book is it took you 35 years to bring the two paths together in the form of a book, because you resisted doing so for a long time because you felt that it would be a premature hybrid. No longer premature, it's a mature intertwining, integration. So please tell us more about how you got here.
Thanks, Michael. As a kid, I just enjoyed playing sports, and there's no indication of any interest in spiritual matters or psychological matters for that matter. We did have a family friend who was an analyst who came over the house, and he was highly respected. And then in my late teens, I had a brief therapy experience with a very kind and wise analyst before I was going to live abroad for some years. And he told me I would be a good psychologist. So that sort of stuck with me. And then I took a class, Psychopathology 101 in CCNY, and it was taught by an analyst from Brooklyn with this thick Brooklyn brogue. And I said to myself that that's going to be me. And I don't know where it came from, but he brought psychoanalysis, particularly the unconscious, to life. And so at an early age, that became a kind of aspiration. During my first more extensive, intensive therapy experience, also in my very early 20s, I was talking about some Kurosawa films. And I was telling my therapist, analyst, that there was something really unusual about them. I couldn't put my finger on them, something about the sense of space or the sense of time. And he said, maybe no time and no space. And I was just shocked and awed by that statement. So that became something that was sort of puzzling in my mind. The other thing is I read a passage from the Dhammapada, one of the early books of Buddhist teachings, and it said, you are what you think, having become what you thought. And it occurred to me, what if thought was not predominating and wasn't constructing reality? What then? So there were these questions that were starting to percolate, and I went on a little bit of a walkabout and had some experiences which were very meaningful. And then I ended up in Maui visiting family, and there was a Zendo down the road, as fate would have it. And although I resisted formal anything, I found myself intrigued, and I was kind of had important questions on my mind about the nature of existence and also about who I was. My father had left as an infant, and I was sort of searching for, I realized later, both my personal and a kind of greater sense of identity. So moved in, became a resident at the Maui Zendo in the early 70s, and noticed something very interesting. And that was that some of my comrades who were, quote unquote, making progress along the path, they were getting more leadership positions in the dojo and so on, they were conducting themselves in the same sort of shabby, thoughtless ways that they had before making progress. And I thought to myself, that's very interesting. I thought that if you did Zen practice and you had some Zen awakenings, that it would really change the way you were and the way you acted. So I remember asking my teacher once about it. And he said, well, such people must not really be doing Zazen. The implication was if they were really practicing, it would reveal itself in their conduct. I was a very new student at that time, but something didn't sit right with me. I was thinking to myself, well, maybe the path of Zen doesn't actually address that, or it doesn't address it in an explicit way. And this happened again with another teacher of my teacher, a Japanese fellow named Yamada Roshi, who was discussing the suicide of a very famous leader of a Zen sect in Japan. And he said it was really, really terrible. And someone asked him, how could it happen? And he said, well, he must have not really been enlightened. And by then I'd been practicing for about 10 years, and I knew that was wrong. He could have been very well enlightened, but there was some other path of growth which he had not been integrating. His emotional growth, his relational growth. And then finally, I think the one event which kind of clinched an interest in these things is I had gone back east to do a doctorate. And I was living in Boston and was preparing to go back to Hawaii via California. And I had a dream. And the dream was just 3 words: east, west, center. And I got up and sitting on my bed, I started to associate to it like a good analyst. I wasn't even in training at that point, but I knew enough. I could just see what comes into my mind. So the first thing was East-West Center, where my teacher, Robert Aitken, had been the director. And then I thought, well, I have been training in Zen, which is in the East, and I came to study Western psychology and get my degree. And then I thought, well, I'm living on the East Coast and I'm going back to the West. And there were a variety of very interesting and fruitful associations, none of which kind of brought an aha. I just sort of sat for a while, was still, and then it just hit me like a lightning bolt. I tapped my right thigh, I said east. I tapped my left thigh west, and I tapped my torso center. And I realized that these were interweaving in myself, and I had no real choice over the matter. They just were.
Wow. I'm so tempted to share some of our overlap in terms of our formative years and early adulthood spent in Hawaii, but I won't do that here. It's really interesting. Let me bring us back, though, to your creating this book after
Yes.
years. What led you to that?
Well, as I imagine you think as well, Michael, perhaps not, is that we write and construct ideas and theories that help us understand ourselves and also help us normalize ourselves in some way and make sense of the complexity that each of us brings to the table. So I had been scribbling on napkins for about 40 years before I put pen to paper and started writing papers. I had some internal obstacles to get over. But I was among a number of people who were thinking in the late 70s, the early 80s. There was Barry Magid, Mark Epstein, Jeff Rubin, and myself. Perhaps there were others as well who were both practicing and being therapists. And so I was thinking about this based on some of those experiences of realizing that there were really 2 tracks to liberation. And finally, Charles Pisano, was doing a book called Soul on the Couch, and he said, Joe, you gave a talk at Division 39. This is back in the early 90s. He said, it was a good talk. Do you want to submit it? And I couldn't believe that anybody would like to read what I had written. But that chapter that I wrote that turned into chapter 1 and 2 of the book was a distillation of about 35, 40 years of integrating these two within myself, though not in public programs or in my practice of either of the two disciplines. And then that led to writing a couple of other chapters, and I had a number of chapters here and there, and writing became a little bit easier for me. And I was just expressing what I was seeing about these two paths as I became more immersed in psychoanalysis, entered training, became a Zen teacher, then an independent Zen master. I felt kind of more empowered to know what I knew and share it, and also not know what I didn't know and share that as well. And then finally, Norton asked me to put these chapters together into a book, which I did. I added one new chapter called The Bliss Body and the Unconscious. And I wrote an introduction and gussied up a couple of the other chapters, all of which I thought stood on their own, but needed a little bit of vitalizing. And the book came together rather quickly. I'm still shocked. I look back at it and I said, who wrote this? How did it come together? I sort of have an out-of-the-body experience about the book, but I do think it's pretty good and has some interesting things in it.
It does indeed. It does indeed. By the way, I just want to give a shout out because we have some people from LAPES over the years too who've been very involved in integrating Zen or Buddhism and psychoanalysis. A shout out to Marjorie Schumann, who I think is in the audience today, who's also written a book recently on Buddhism, meditation, and psychoanalysis. Anyway, I wanted to come back to sort of the intertwining of Zen and psychoanalysis. You see them as intertwining. So I wanted to see if you could kind of flesh out a little more about how they overlap and maybe where they don't.
Yeah, I want to approach that in a couple of different ways. One is to talk about what Zen brings to psychoanalysis and how it challenges it. And then what psychoanalysis brings to Zen and how it challenges it as worthy adversaries. Not really adversaries, because they're on the same team. The team is about liberation, creating aliveness, and living a life worth living. But they do help one another and challenge one another in important ways. Just want to lay out a little bit of a framework before we dive a little bit more into this. It's an interesting framework. I grew up on the mother's milk of social action. And that's always been a part of my teaching or my thought. So there's, on the one hand, justice, and then there's freedom. And then on the other hand, there's peace. And it's interesting that in Deep Streams Institute, our nonprofit organization, we have Zen practice, which is kind of practice of peace. We have model building and interdisciplinary seminars, which lead to a sense of liberation and freedom. And then there's an element of justice in the sense of responsive action in the world. And these three branches, if you wish, are called dhyana, prajna, and shila in Buddhism. Meditation, practice, attentiveness, practice of peace. Prajna meaning knowledge, understanding, insight, and the fruit of that is freedom. And shila being conduct, awakened conduct, and the fruit of that being justice. So I just kind of lay that out there because we're going to come back and tap into one or the other of those branches as we discuss the similarities and difference. Because psychoanalysis certainly has its own meditation, its own form of attentiveness. and its own insights and its own responsive actions in the world. But I came up with this thought that, most simply put, Zen is about spiritual growth and spiritual experience and freedom. And psychoanalysis, at its best, facilitates emotional growth. And emotional growth both interiorly and in the relational field. And that these two capacities, these two streams, as they intertwine, they're like the double helix molecule. They're separate, but they make contact with each other along the way, and they enrich and challenge one another as they create an integrative narrative for what it really means to be a human being. So let me just say one more thing, and then we'll just continue this conversation, Michael. The strength of each path is also its limit. The strength of each path is also its limit. And I think the title of the new chapter in the book, The Bliss Body and the Unconscious, will highlight this. I think the gold that psychoanalysis brings to a narrative about human growth is the unconscious. The intrapsychic unconscious, the relational field of the unconscious, the fact that there is unconscious motivation, unconscious intention, and we know that the unconscious distills conflict, but there's also the unrepressed unconscious, a great hidden part of who we are from which we can bring forth creative gifts. Making an ally of the unconscious is quite something, and one of the main features of a good analysis, I think. Mm-hmm. Zen and Buddhism in general does not recognize these kinds of unconscious. I remember telling a dear friend of mine who's a very well-known meditation teacher in the area, the title, I was thinking of naming the book, The Bliss Body and the Unconscious, and she laughed. And I said, what are you laughing about? She says, well, I love the bliss body. And I understood right away. And this person is a therapist with years under her belt. She doesn't practice anymore. But there was just something off-putting about the unconscious for people who are prioritizing meditation practice, which really is a mobilizing of attentive consciousness, and rather than tapping into the unconscious. So by bliss body, what do I mean? There's a famous line in Zen: to study Zen is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. Not to eliminate, but to forget self-preoccupation. To forget the self is to be awakened by the 10,000 things. So the freedom that we discover through assiduous Zen practice is a profound, deep sense of all beings, each and every being, being completely sacred, completely enlightened from the beginning. And at the same time, that we and all beings are kin, also intrinsically from the beginning. In all our distinctiveness, we make one another possible. And this realization usually is thought to bring up, and does bring up, a great sense of compassion for all beings, because lack of awareness of these two elements causes so much suffering. And we sort of weep mythically for the suffering of the world. The problem is in applying Zen realization in daily living, in one's relationships. And that's what I was noticing early on, is that there wasn't necessarily a translation from practice and realization, even wisdom, into responsive, awakened conduct. Something would get lost in translation. I would think that my stuff doesn't smell, but other people might not feel that way, and I might be the last to know. So that, I like to say, if you want to know the quality of someone's actual being, ask their cat or their dog or their partner. Usually we don't know. So I've come to see that awareness of unconscious, particularly unconscious intention and unconscious motivation, is a critical contribution that psychoanalysis has to make to the Zen project of awakening and distilling and refining character on the basis of that awakening. What Zen brings to the table to psychoanalysis, and I'm simplifying, but I just want to highlight the main thing, is this bliss body. That's to say, we're walking by people every day. We ignore the extraordinariness of our ordinary life. And Zen makes very clear is that if we could put aside our self-preoccupations, our clinging to our conceptual formulations, the mind could naturally become still, and we can be immersed in any task. It could be counting our breaths, it could be washing the floor. Immersed in any task, having given over ourselves to that task, then anything can awaken us to the sacredness, to the divinity or holiness, if you will, of this very moment, this very being in front of us, what we pass over as ordinary. So in Zen, we say Zen is standing up and sitting down, laughing and weeping. And I think as analysts, we have had a tendency over the years to look for deep reasons for things, to untie certain knots. We have analyzed content quite a bit, dynamic themes. We prioritize associative thinking. And yet, at the margins, at the extreme, this can make it difficult for us to bear witness to the jewel right in front of our nose, and the sense of contentment that comes from that.
So, Joe, let me see if I can bring this down into some phenomena that both Zen approach in certain ways and psychoanalysis perhaps in others. And let's see if we can find the gold in each. And I'm wondering if I can suggest some issues, so to speak, or concepts, and you can more or less free associate and tell us kind of what it brings up from either tradition or how they intertwine. You've already touched on unconscious communication. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about interbeing and radical intersubjectivity, for example, and then I'll bring in a few other ideas.
Well, maybe I will talk about the respective models of intersubjectivity in contemporary psychoanalysis and in Zen.
Mm-hmm.
I'll start with Zen. I've described the process for the moment, but there's a metaphor in Buddhism. It's called the jeweled net of Indra that sort of represents model of the mind, model of our life. So imagine a vast living, breathing web, and at each point in the web, at each knot, there's a jewel. And each jewel is shining with its own light, and yet because it's a web, it's a spherical web, each jewel also reflects all the other jewels inside of it. And so the all is in the one, and the one must shine forth for everybody to discover the all. It's a wonderful image where we're not so much united as in solidarity, and each of us bringing our own distinctive quality to the togetherness. Thich Nhat Hanh coined the word interbeing, that it's not so much that I am, but I inter-am with everybody else. This is what the jeweled net of Indra is trying to convey. Winnicott in his own way in saying that there comes a point in the baby's development where you can't say baby without saying mother. And I like to add, you can't say mother without saying father. I think you and I like to get the father in there, Michael, but just this sense of absolute contingency. Thich Nhat Hanh likes to talk about the sheet of paper. In the sheet of paper, there's the sun, there's the lumberjack, there's the tree. They're all contained in there. Without any one of them, that paper wouldn't be paper. So there's this very radical intersubjectivity in Buddhism, which has been around for at least 1,000 years. I like to say that psychoanalysis puts flesh, human flesh, on the filaments of that web. It brings it down to the basics. First of all, it brings it to emotions. And not only conscious emotions, which we can become aware of, but unconscious emotions. And not only unconscious emotions, but unconscious emotions that we're communicating naturally, as a matter of course, with the people we meet. I love it that Bion says when two people meet, there's an emotional storm, that there's a field that gets constellated. And so it's one thing to talk about this radical kind of intersubjectivity, existential subjectivity in Buddhism, but it's another to become skilled in the psychoanalytic intersubjectivity. And here's an example. I was dropping my son off at school many years ago, and we had just had a fight. And I asked him, I turned around, I said, "Why do you make me so mad?" And he was like 8 or 9. He said, "Well, that's easy, Dad, because it's easier for you to be mad than for me to be mad." And, you know, he didn't know anything about the concept of projective identification, but he was just being very honest. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I just met with a potential new patient the other day who asked me what I thought about intuition. Now I think we had different ideas about what intuition was, but I thought, I'm for it. You know, it's a good thing. And not only that, but it happens all the time between people. So the good part, what psychoanalysis brings to this narrative around intersubjectivity, is that we can be a unique and robust singular individual and at the same time be partaking of what Adam Phillips called the black market of emotions, the hidden black market of emotion.
Well, that leads nicely into what I wanted to also bring up, because this is a concept that I think is so misunderstood. The idea of the no self or self and ego. And would you speak a little bit about that?
Oh, definitely. It's tough to speak a little bit about it, but I'll try. And you've got the hook in the
book,
the hook in the winch, so you'll reel me in. But let's start with ego, because one of the most misunderstood terms. I really don't agree with the way it's used in spiritual circles. I like the way it's used in psychoanalysis. I like ego capacities. I like to say, I have fought and struggled, and my ego capacities, such as they are hard fought, hard won. And I like them. I don't want to give them up. I don't want to sacrifice them. I don't want to let go of them. They're not my problem. And I don't think they're anyone's problem. And the same thing with the sense of self. People think it's just words, but I don't think it's just syntactical here. I think some people think this, even the sense of self, the whiff of a separate identity, is already delusional. I do not. I think the sense of self is very, very important. As long as we don't cleave out of trauma or other reasons to maladaptive, hijacking versions of that self that colonize us. And we're not rendered helpless by those versions of self and other that torture us. But a good, hearty sense of self and ego capacities, I'll take half a dozen and then even maybe a dozen. So I want to read a quote from Freud. that I don't know if a lot of people know about. He says, a strong egoism is a protection against falling ill. But in the last resort, we must begin to love in order not to fall ill. And we are bound to fall ill if, in consequence of frustration, we are unable to love. So if I were to look at that through a Buddhist lens, if we can't find compassion in our hearts for ourselves, for the beings, our loved ones, for our wider community, for the more than human world, for our planet, if we cannot find a way to feel kin with them, interbeing with them, then we're not going to be able to bring forward our best compassionate, awakened response. You know, Michael, people often equate Zen with stillness, but the stillness and the peace and the vast emptiness that sometimes comes about through Zen is not quietude. What's privileged in Zen is responsiveness, and that's not commonly known. Mm-hmm. Responsiveness in accord with the circumstances of the moment. That's to say, not with my agendas, but with my being fully tuned in to what's going on in my world and responding in accord with compassion. And I don't mean compassion as weak. I mean compassion as courageous and having its own forcefulness.
So that seems to interface, in my mind, with the psychoanalytic concept of neutrality and the Buddhist concept of equanimity. And it kind of brings us a little more into the consulting room of therapists and analysts, too. So maybe you could say a little more about that.
At some point, I might want to get back also to the no-self piece, because it's really important. But yeah, neutrality and equanimity. Well, first of all, we're never neutral, ever. The minute the patient walks in, he sees who we are, he looks at our books, he senses us, he feels our energy, the pheromones, he probably gets the scent in the room. We're known quantities. The other thing, although I love Beyond, I do not think we can ever totally eschew memory and desire. The only thing we can eschew is our unconscious attachments to certain versions, certain agendas about memory and desire. So I actually think we do have a desire as analysts, and our desire is both to help the patient find liberation and enjoyment and aliveness, and to grow ourselves. Of course, that's the dirty secret, right? That many patients don't know, is that we're getting almost, if not as much as the patient is getting out of some of the treatments we're involved in. There's an Aboriginal elder who said, about white people coming to her neighborhood, if you're coming to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you understand in your marrow that your liberation and my liberation are bound up together, then come on in and we'll do some work together. So I think if we understand neutrality in that way, that we're both analyst and patient have the intention of helping the patient grow, while understanding that it's a radically interactive process through which the analyst will suffer and will have to overcome some of that suffering. And in fact, the analyst will have to suffer some of the patient's unmetabolized suffering, and that's the way it needs to be. But it won't kill the analyst, because they've got some really good ego capacities. Or if they do die, then they'll be reborn rather quickly. So now, what is equanimity? Well, equanimity is one of the four. Equanimity is also commonly misunderstood. It's one of the four awakened qualities in Buddhism, the qualities of an awakened being. But since all of us are more awakening than awakened, they're the things that we value, the things that we see in one another that we brighten up for. And, one is love, or a friendly kind of love, sometimes called metta or loving kindness. I like to call it more kindness or love. And the second is compassion or karuna. The third is my favorite, is mudita, which is joy in the joy of others. I think this really is the obverse of malicious envy. To truly understand, Michael, our interbeing at such a level that when you celebrate, it's not that I celebrate for you. When you celebrate, I celebrate. Because our liberation is bound to one another in that radical intersubjectivity you were talking about. And when I work on myself, when I get through a certain impediment, you celebrate. That's the bodhisattva who takes joy in the liberation of others. And then the fourth element is equanimity. I was going to say equilibrium. Sometimes equanimity is mistaken for equilibrium. But equanimity is what we were talking about before in terms of what the analyst has to go through. The analyst has to go through everything. His own stuff, his family of origin, the challenges of his life, the personal challenges, intergenerational issues, all of the counter-projective identifications that the patient brings up in him. He needs to, like Grotstein so beautifully said, sometimes hold in trusteeship elements of the patient's experience that the patient not only doesn't know about, but can't bear. So even if we're glib and we're full of zeal and we want to make some interpretation, we know we can't do it. So we've got to sit through all the storms, not being perfect by any means, but surviving and keeping our wits and our best qualities about us, staying fit for duty, coming in fit for duty every morning. And so that's the kind of equanimity that the Buddha is talking about.
Well, that sort of leads to follow up with your point about Beyond. Beyond's offered us a number of wonderful ideas and ways of practicing that certainly bring in principles that aren't far removed from Buddhism and Hinduism as well. And in particular, I wonder if you could say a little bit about the idea of reverie and also Beyond's concept and idea of O.
Yeah. So much has been said about reverie. What I can say is a little bit of how I work. And I realized when I wrote a chapter for the book that I mobilized a kind of internal resonance chamber in my heart, in my rib cage, in my body. Body was like a resonance chamber. And what I did, I was working with a couple of patients who had dissociative elements to their makeup. And sometimes it was difficult to decide what was true. And so what I would do is take the experience or the affect or the sort of gestalt I was wrestling with, and I put it in my resonance chamber, and I'd sort of shake it about, and I'd see what emerged. And that resonance chamber is the heart and mind of the mother, if you will, or the father, the mother analyst, who doesn't just listen to the words, and when there's disturbance, doesn't try to fix it. I mean, that's the last thing I try to do. Just like the Aboriginal woman said to the white man, if you're trying to fix me, you're trying to make it better, just turn around and go home. And so I think Beyond is talking about a radical freedom, and he uses the word think, the radical freedom to think, But his thinking is not just discursive thinking. In fact, has nothing to do with discursive thinking. It is reverie. It's using the whole body-mind resonance chamber to let it sift around in there and to give up needing to know, needing to have an answer, figuring it out, the urgency, the zeal to be therapeutic, give it all up. And I think, for many analysts, particularly early on, it's very difficult to do because the idea is, well, I got to be doing something. I got to be earning my keep here. But in fact, people cannot pay us enough for this very function, because out of this very function comes something wonderful, some hunch, some experience of the analyst, which he can share explicitly, verbally, or not, through action with the patient. And it's something that they have created together. So this is how I work with reverie. Now, O is a very interesting thing. Did you have something else, Michael?
Well, first let me say that anybody in the audience who wants to pose a question, please do so again by using your chat function, and then go directly to the questions here space, and the question will be sent to us so we can bring it in. I did want to mention that you're talking about reverie in a very important way, which is akin to, of course, the mother or the feminine somehow metabolizing. In your image, to me, it's a snow globe, where you allow it to hit you in some way, and something gets formed or birthed out of that. And one of the questions that has already come through, which I think is a very good one, is that we've so far talked about your influencers who have been men, both in the psychoanalytic field primarily and in the Zen field. And one of the questioners wanted to know a little bit more about, have there been women who've been important influencers of your own development? So,
well, first let me say, because of my own history, it's been very important for me, not consciously, but unconsciously, to find good mentors and teachers and therapists and analysts to fill in the lack growing up. So I have done royally well in such people. Of course, there have been many friends and colleagues and teachers who have been female. I'll just mention a few associated with the LACE community, two of which I'm dearly in love with, and one just a wonderful supervisor, Vicki Hamilton, who has a way as well of bringing together different thinkers, creative painting, piano, with her way of both thinking about and integrating and doing psychoanalysis. So Vicki was just a beautiful person, is a beautiful person, and we spent a good bit of time together. I just loved her energy, very strong, yet very, very sensitive. The two women I fell in love with are Jean Sanville and Hedda Bolger. Jean and I have been in love for 25 years, and still are, even though she's gone. Yeah. All I had to do was come over her house, and we would look each other in the eyes, and she'd say, "Well, Joe, I want to hear it all." So much love that went both ways. And it was wonderful not to be her supervisee or not to be her patient, but to be her dear friend. Mm. And to a somewhat lesser degree with Hedda Bolger, who everybody knows, so I won't describe her miraculousness, only to say that I would stay, after Jean died, I would stay at Hedda's house when I came down to visit my Buddhist analyst friends in LA, of whom there are many, Marjorie and Karen and and you, Michael, and others. And in the afternoon, as the light was going down, we'd be talking, and we'd talk our way into darkness. And she said one thing that was really amazing. I mean, I don't want this to be all about Hedda, but someone asked this question about women. So let me just tell this story, that one of the things in the growing shade in the room that we didn't turn the light on for, and that sort of darkness of creativity that we were exploring, she said, you know, Joe, I do this thing, I don't tell many people about it, but I do this thing now where I just get very quiet and I don't think about anything. And I just let my mind go. And it's a little weird because I'm still with the patient, you know, so I have to look at them and listen to the words and all that stuff. But really, I'm not really there. And, you know, and then something comes up and I say it. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why. They seem to find it helpful, she said. In her memorial service, I was at a table with her oldest patient, just completely by chance. 95, 98 years old was her oldest patient. And she told me about her last session with Hedda, which was 2 weeks, 3 weeks before Hedda died. And I said, well, what was it like? She said, it was really interesting. She would do this thing where it was like her eyes would go back in her head, but not really. And, you know, it was like she wasn't totally there in the ways that you were used to. And then she was. And then she would say this thing that made you really think and made you think about yourself in a completely new way. And I felt, oh my God, Hedda, you're giving me such a wonderful gift. You're giving me permission to indulge in the kind of reverie, right, Michael, that we're talking about.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, in fact, Joe, you and I met many years ago when you lived in San Francisco, and we met through Hedda and Jean because we were both friends with them and would overlap many times. So that was very rich. And of course, Hedda, when she came to Southern California, she got involved with Krishnamurti, so had that in her background. Let me bring us back to a question that's kind of been sitting there that also is coming from one of the audience members, and that is the relationship between O, beyond's O, and enlightenment, and maybe the no self, which I know you wanted to get back to. So let's play with that a little bit.
Okay. O is sometimes thought of as, you know, awesome. Well, first let me say something about Beyond. So Beyond, if I was raised on the mother's milk of progressive politics, Beyond was raised on the mother's milk of Indian culture and Hindu religion. Mm-hmm. He had an Indian nursemaid, and he grew up in India. And we can never discount the influence of some of those early times and how they, in a way, transcend, you know, didactic learning. And his idea about O is very much like Atman, very much like the great self, mm-hmm. this great essence that includes everything. And I would have loved to hear Beyond talk about O. So this is derived not only from my reading, but from my listening, being pretty close to Jim Grotstein, Neville Symington, Michael Eigen, and in late in his life, Jim Gooch, but primarily those three. I think sometimes we think about O in a kind of uh-oh way, you know, that it's so awesome, and it's sort of the real, you know, something that is overwhelming to us, we can't really approach. But O for Beyond, he sometimes calls the Godhead, the sacred, the divine. And then he writes about transformations in O. So I think it's used within psychoanalysis in a number of ways. One is that the analyst needs to find this space of reverie, Michael, that we've been talking about. And that permits the unmetabolizable item that's wanting representation, it permits it to be revealed, because Bion has the different links, and one of the L, love, H, hate, K, knowledge. Michael Eigen talks about F, faith, in some wonderful papers, but then there's O. And I think what Bion is saying, that there are certain things which we can't just process through the K-link. We've got to, it can't be talked about on the level of discursive thinking. We're not going to figure it out. We need to both go into a joint reverie, maybe a meditation à deux, and then think together, quote unquote, and see what emerges. And what emerges then emerges in K, and we can talk about it. We can parse it out. So I think this is the way that O is generally used in psychoanalysis. But now, it also means the ultimate. It also means the Godhead or the divine, something we can't put words to. Bion plays with words. He says it must be been, B-E-E-N. And he talks about a cucumber. The cucumber bees the cucumber. And we have all kinds of language fixes for this kind of sense of identity, an object being just this. But where Zen challenges, and I think is important to challenge Bion's view of O, is the same way in which the Buddha challenged Hinduism. That's to say, the Buddha and Buddhism said that it's not about an Atman, it's not about some essence, it's about anatman, or anatta, no self. It's about not clinging, not craving, not grasping after any final solution, after any agenda whatsoever. And then in that space, forgetting self-construction, and particularly self-preoccupation and self-torture, in that space, that welcoming, peaceful, limitless belonging space, there's an awakening. For the Buddha, it was when he was under the sitting under the bo tree, and he saw the North Star as if for the first time. And in the Zen narrative, he's supposed to have said, "Oh, now I see that from the beginning, all beings themselves are awakened. It's only our attachments and delusions which keep us from bearing witness to this." Mm. So the import of that realization, Michael, and living it out in daily life is we don't have to go to a special place. Mm-hmm. We don't have to go to the O place and then back to the K place. It's very valuable in the analytic room to think about it in that way. But actually, if we're interested in spiritual experience, it's hitting us upside the head every moment. Mm-hmm. A famous Korean Zen master said, only don't know. God is calling, but your phone is busy.
The don't know mind. It reminds me too of how Bion, took the Keats's idea of negative capability and brought that into the consulting room as a very, very important aspect of analytic technique.
And it informs the second noble truth. I think it's really a nice way of thinking about it, because in classical Buddhism, the second noble truth is that the cause of suffering, which classically is thought about as desire. Mm-hmm. And we know it's not any kind of desire. It's certain kinds of desires that can cause great suffering. Mm-hmm. But one of Keats's phrase that Bion uses is grasping out through the five senses. Mm-hmm. Now, another way in which asceticism and Hindu religion, and Bion to some degree, says that O is not sensual. He agrees that the senses cloud things. We've got to get to this place where there's no sensory experience or attachment, that O is beyond the senses. Whereas in Buddhism, in Bobrow's Buddhism at least, the second noble truth is the source of suffering is tanha, or grasping, or and not desire in the sense of enjoying the senses, but desire in the sense of using sensory modalities to grasp out, possess, extract, consume, try to find something that we don't have, try to get more and more and more. That's what causes great suffering. So this idea of grasping out through the five senses, I think Bion does use, as well as Keats's negative capability.
One of the questions that several people have posed from the audience already is they'd like to understand a little more clearly what is meant by spiritual growth, and what about the idea of God, and where does that come into play?
I am all for God, for the divine. I especially love the divine feminine. I'm for the holy. Doesn't matter to me. You can use any language you want. I'll even fall into essentialism, and it doesn't matter. The question is, are you living it? That's the real question. In Buddhism, we talk about Buddha nature. Bion talks about or that divinity. Buddha nature is an intrinsic sense of being awakened. It's not something we need to add to it. So that I want to say more about the God part. What was the other part of the question?
Well, they wanted to know more about what does spiritual growth really mean.
Right. So spiritual growth, there's a fellow named Arthur Dykman, who in a very quiet way was doing a lot of this integrating quietly under the radar. His books are not too well known, but he gave one of the best definitions of spirituality. And that is the search for, the experience of, and the embodiment of a profound and ever deepening sense of connection with all of life. I like to call it the ABCs of Zen, a bigger container. All of us want to have our own personal identity and our personal problems held in the biggest container possible. That biggest container is the universe. We can call it the universe, we can call it emptiness, we can call it shunyata, emptiness, we can call it no self, call it Buddha nature. We're practicing it in the analytic room, but I don't like the word emptiness because it brings up a lot of stuff. It brings up a lot of stuff for me about abandonment and separation. I heard another phrase for emptiness or no self that I just loved, Michael. It was limitless belonging. So it's not really a void, right? It's more like Winnicott's potential space, but potential in a limitless sense. And we are part and parcel of that limitless belonging, a participant observer. And I think when we have a sense of that in our life, it helps us work through the personal stuff. And then as we work through the personal stuff, it opens us up to this other deeper, vaster sense of being connected.
I love your ABC, by the way. A bigger container. I think we share an approach to psychoanalysis where we both try to bring a bigger container to it. And in particular, you're really trying to bring in more of a spiritual way of understanding within a psychoanalytic framework.
Well, I can do another very quick example of something, Michael, where psychoanalysis has a prejudice against this. I don't say everybody, but during my training, a fellow candidate, a wonderful woman who normally would not be like this, she was actually instantiating what she thought was a psychoanalytic prejudice. She was talking about her case in case conference, and she had a European patient who used the article when it wasn't needed. And he was saying that he was hurting so much, he went into the nature. And she laughed at him, both at his sentence structure and at the fact that he would go into nature when he was feeling bad. And I thought to myself, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. That is some kind of prejudice against this wider sense of a living, breathing, interconnected web we're all part of. Mm-hmm. Why wouldn't someone go into nature? Why wouldn't they sit at the foot of a redwood tree or down by a babbling brook or see the beasts and the birds and feel calmed and inspired by that? And so I think there was something at that point in time in psychoanalysis where it was still, like everything is intrapsychic, and anything that's not looking at your problems is a defense and a resistance. Mm. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, sure. Well, let me ask you a little bit more to elaborate on how you see yourself bringing in any Zen principles into your psychoanalytic practice. And in particular, do you ever ask or suggest using meditation as part of the work?
Not using it as part of the work with me, mm-hmm. but I do, as I did recently with a new potential new patient who literally cannot stop texting, cannot stop working, is just on this treadmill. I said, look, if you want to work together, you need to practice meditation as well as our working. So you can do that separately. And I actually thought for her, it was almost required. And I've never actually done that before, but I thought this particular person needs to slow down, and talking with me once, twice, it's not going to be enough. Needs a little bit more psychophysiological kind of practice to do that, and then we'll do what we do in the consulting room. When I've done hospital consults or emergency room consults, when I worked at hospital settings, of course, if someone was in a panic attack, I'd do meditation with them. If there was some emergent situation with a patient, but I don't see that many cases like that now. So I don't do meditation or prescribe meditation in the room. However, most people who come to see me, they know I have this other side. It's one click away. And sometimes they come because they know that, because they're maybe looking for a certain environment or looking for a certain outlook or looking for someone who's open to intuition or open to synchronicity. I happen to tell this person, I like synchronicity too, but I don't make that big a deal of it because it happens all the time. But I think this person liked that I was open to some of these concepts without agreeing with everything they were going to say. Mm-hmm. However, I do think Zen has always informed the way that I present myself, the way that I unconsciously hold myself in the room, those nonverbal things, the way that I listen, the way that I don't ask a question, the way that I stay silent, the way that I poke my nose in when someone's in the middle of a sentence. Mm-hmm. I like to think that I have a measure of freedom, both to think, to feel, to be, and to create an environment and to interact with the patient in the way that I'm sensing will be most helpful to that patient. So there's a measure of trust in myself, which I think is hard won. At the same time, I know that we're all inclined to think that our stuff doesn't smell. So I try to track the impacts of my conduct and my statements over a period of time. And for that, I need to listen to the patient, because usually they're going to be the best, they're going to have the best account of how things are going, and not only by what they're saying, but about how they're being.
Mm-hmm. One of our audience members picked up on the meditation in practice, and she says, why wouldn't you, or he, why wouldn't you suggest it actually in a session?
Yeah, that's what Dan Siegel asks people. We had a big program years ago where Dan was one of the featured speakers. And, I'll say two reasons. Whatever you do in your practice, may 1,000 flowers bloom. I don't have a judgmental attitude. In fact, I supervise people who use all manner of mindfulness in their work, in their analytic work, who do things very differently. And so I'm very accepting. I find, however, that in my consulting room, I want to promote by my own being a meditation à deux. I want to promote the kind of meditation that Freud was talking about, where we each have a receiver and a transmitter, and we're communicating underneath the threshold of cognitive thought. What Alan Shore has been identifying as a right brain to right brain communication. I want to allow room for the data to emerge out of this kind of meditation. And so I bring some chops to that because of my Zen training and because of my own analytic experience. And I help create that kind of environment. And someone walks into that, and hopefully they will learn how to do this psychoanalytic meditation with me. Mm-hmm. And again, yeah.
Well,
so the other thing I also find is that occasionally when an analytic patient asks me about meditation, they're looking for a quick fix. Mm-hmm. They're looking for something that will get them out of something they don't know, feels bad, or feels bad because they can't figure it out. Mm-hmm. And if I can find a way to hang in there myself and hang in there with them, then we often make hay.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions that's come up in a couple of different forms has to do with trust and the resistance that we all know about, that we have to deal with in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. And it brings to mind kind of the stereotypes that exist both about Zen and about psychoanalysis. Zen, you'll be in a state of enlightenment or equanimity, and you never get angry, you never get upset, and so on. Psychoanalysis, that you're always kind of sitting back and waiting to interpret. So maybe we could play a little bit with trust, resistance, and reality.
Well, I'm going to use a little different words because the intention that I'm hearing in the question has to do with ideals, ego ideals about patient, analyst, the fully functioning person, the fully analyzed analyst, the post-analysis analysand, self-analysis, and on the other hand, and I think both of these paths suffer from very unreal idealizations of all of the characters in their respective paths. So in Zen, it would be the Zen master. I like to say that when, my son, who was at the time 13, came to pose a question to me during my transmission ceremony, hundreds of people, this all very ritualized kind of thing. And people come up and they challenge you and you respond to them. And it's an old Zen custom. He came up and he said, why haven't you mastered my laundry yet? And I thought that was the best question. And I told him, I'm sorry, I haven't mastered it. I'm just clueless about it, but I'll keep working at it. I'm perfect just as I am, but I can always get better. And I think people have these ideals that somehow if you've gone through the practice of peace, of observation, of non-duality, if you've had awakenings, if you've seen through the self-preoccupation to liberation, if you have gone through awakened conduct, and that you're never going to feel bad again. You're never going to feel anything afflictive again. This brings us to the whole question of the three poisons, the three kleshas. or the three obstacles to awakened living. And they are greed, hatred, and delusion. Now, we see all of them in spades in our world today. I'm not going to get into that right now. But there, but for the grace of God, go I. And all of us are inclined to become greedy. All of us are inclined toward hatred. All of us get caught up in delusion and ignorance. So that Zen awakening or Zen practice is no get out of jail free card, does not have a monopoly on, and isn't an exemption, that's the word I'm looking for, is not an exemption from the slings and arrows. In fact, in my life, I've benefited from both, and they've really helped me. So now, what about the analytic situation? The question was again.
Well, about resistance and
Oh, yeah. No, let me just talk about, I'm going to slant it slightly differently because I think it was part of the intention of the question, is likewise, as we know so well, the post and analytic life for an analyst is filled with Sturm und Drang. We still get our traumas triggered. And it's just like maybe we have some more inner strength, some more inner resilience to cope with it. Mm-hmm. And likewise, a patient coming into analysis shouldn't think that they will always feel good or that they'll always feel bad, that they'll come to a place where their range of affect and their range of experience is widened, their sense of themselves perhaps deepened, and hopefully they have more access to the positive experiences of contentment and joy in daily life. I think the Zen narrative helps them with that. In terms of resistance and trust, trust takes a long time to grow, as we know, in the analytic room. And resistance is one of those concepts like defense that I find that a lot of therapists overdo in their comments. You know, they're sort of on the alert for resistance. They're on the alert for the defense. And I'm not saying they don't exist, but I'm more interested in what the patient needs in the field between them to represent what is going unrepresented in their psyche in any given moment, due primarily to anxiety or lack of capacity to represent it. Now, I just think defense and resistance are part of the process. We see it all, every moment is part defense, part not, part, is it mastery, is it defense, it's part mastery, it's part defense. I don't think in terms of those terms so much anymore, but what emotional quality within me, what field between us, what ingredients are necessary for what needs to manifest, what, you know, can do it. And so in Bion's terms, the selected fact can rise. It may not be just one, it may be two selected facts. It may be no selected facts until 4 more sessions, but I do have a sense that there's a deep emerging of the patient's experience, and I want to be able to facilitate that.
Thank you. It's such a good example of what you mean by enlarging the container. It's really the positioning of yourself as the analyst in a way that opens to so much more. Mm-hmm. I want to kind of conclude the questioning part and leave a minute or two for maybe a closing meditation. But several questions, and certainly one that I have all the time, is, what's going on right now in terms of COVID and protests and the political situation and the world we're all living in. You've been very much an activist for all your life, and in addition to a Zen Buddhist and psychoanalytic practitioner. What can Zen offer us in the way of trying to make sense of what's going on right now?
Well, 2 things right off the bat. There is an inner strength, an inner hardiness, an emotional strength suppleness, steadiness of heart that develops over long period of Zen practice. We can try to use it to reduce stress, right, in the early phases of practice, and it may or may not. Usually it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it makes things worse when you open up that field. But if you continue, you really keep the nose to the grindstone, there is a way in which you develop a kind of meditative muscle where very little throws you for a loop. You may feel the impact, but you're not that surprised. And so I think that regular meditation practice can help develop this suppleness of heart where we let in, say, the tragedy and the sorrow. We let in a range of feelings from helplessness, despair, anger, love, grief, and we're not collapsed by any of them. So we feel, but we're not, and we let ourselves be transformed by them. And we let ourselves think about and consider action. We let action arise out of that awareness and mindfulness of those factors. But we don't necessarily become destroyed. Or if we do get knocked down, we get up quicker than if we didn't have that practice on board. I think the other three things are these three poisons: greed, hatred, and ignorance. And how important it is for us to understand how easily it is for those to be monetized, weaponized, gaslit, and for even us to be colonized by consumerism, by divisive hatred, by the greed, even the desperate desire that things change on a dime. Maybe that has an element of greed to it. The ability to stay with things, to see things truly. I think Zen adds a good deal of that. I chanted the four great vows. We now call them the four infinite vows. They're chanted in Mahayana temples all around the country, all around the world. I chanted these four great vows for almost 50 years before I realized that they were really true. I couldn't believe it. And so the second vow goes like this. Greed, hatred, and delusion rise endlessly. I vow to end them. So this vow is kind of like a Don Quixote vow or a Sisyphus vow, that I'm going to keep walking up that path. I'm going to keep this vow alive. I'm going to devote myself to that vow and learn and refine the psychic fuels and motivations which drive me, because sometimes I may be driven by greed, some derivative, hatred, some derivative, or delusion of some derivative. And I will kind of, quote unquote, purify myself of those motivations. And yet at the same time, as part of that vow, they arise, they continually arise. And this has been one of the lessons for me now, Michael. I'm not sure we can become attached to the fruits of whatever we're doing. I think we just need to do what we're called to do. And we need to stay fit for duty and not be destroyed or drown. And then whatever it is we do because we feel it's right. It comes from our hearts. And we understand we may not see the results of that. For years, we may never see the results of that. So acting from a sense of what's right, what's good. Remember the Dalai Lama saying this in a small group about 10 years ago. They asked him, well, do you ever feel angry or ever feel upset with what's going on in your country? And he says, of course I do. I grieve, I'm concerned, I get upset. So they said, well, what do you do? And he said, well, of course I do my practices. And then he said something which really shocked me. He says, I think that this is the way it is now. What about in 100 years? And I thought to myself, well, in a way, we may not have 100 years. We may not have 100 months. But at the same time, at the time, which is about 20 years ago, I was awestruck by the big picture and how easy it is for us to get caught up in wanting to see instant results. And we may not. But solidarity and the joyfulness in solidarity is a wonderful thing in and of itself.
Well, Joe, I wish we could continue much longer, but I know time is really up for many, many, many people in this group. We do have to pay attention to time, I am afraid. I want to give you a chance in the last 30 seconds if you want to do anything with it. Please do, and then we'll sign off.
Let's do that. The first thing I want to say is thank you to everybody for making this possible, for all around the area, the country, maybe the world. And many, many thanks to you, Michael, to Martha, to Lisa, to Jan, all of the people whose efforts went into making this exchange possible. What I'd like to do is I'd just like to lead us in a 60-second closing meditation. So let yourself feel the weight of your body on your chair and all the energy from the exchanges and the ideas and the experiences, stimulatingness of all of that. Just allow it to quiet down, the energy to drop from your head into your heart, your belly. And feel the rising and the falling of your breath. And let yourselves feel that we are together, the 60 or the 80 or the 100 of us today. Let yourself feel this collective presence, inclining toward peace, freedom, and justice. Supporting each other with each breath.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Michael.
Namaste to all. Shalom and aloha nui loa. Thank you all.
Thanks again, Michael.